You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 9,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. Forget the harps and halos. We're going beyond the myth to dissect the literal anatomy of an angel. From their skeletal structure to their internal organs, brace yourself for a visceral and deeply unsettling look at the biological composition of a celestial being that will forever change how you see the divine. My name is Dr. Jake McDonald. I'm a forensic pathologist with the State Medical Examiner's Office in Virginia. Over my 23-year career, I've performed over 2,000 autopsies. I've seen bodies pulled from wreckage, from water, from fires. I've examined the victims of violence and disease, the results of accidents, both tragic and preventable. I've held human hearts in my hands, traced the pathways of fatal wounds, documented the precise moment where life became death. I thought I'd seen everything the human body could show me. I thought I understood the limits of biological possibility. I was wrong. What you're about to hear has been classified for 18 months. Today, that changes. This is the story of what we found in December of 2023, and what it means for everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. This is the story of the day we discovered that myths bleed. It started on a Wednesday morning, December 14th, 3:47 in the morning, to be exact, at a remote research station in northern Alaska, 200 miles from the nearest town. The station was operated by the SETI Institute, monitoring deep space radio signals, searching for signs of intelligent life among the stars. It's isolated work, the kind that attracts people who don't mind long silences and longer winters. The kind of place where you can go days without seeing another human face, where the darkness lasts for months and the cold can kill you in minutes if you're not careful. Griffin Weeks was the station commander that night. He'd been at the facility for 6 months, managing a crew of 8 scientists and technicians. He's a practical man, the kind who doesn't believe in things he can't measure or quantify. He describes what happened in a voice that still carries the weight of disbelief, even now, even after everything he saw. We were running standard monitoring protocols, nothing unusual. The equipment had been humming along normally for weeks. We'd been tracking some interesting signals from a region near Proxima Centauri, but nothing that suggested actual communication. Just cosmic noise, the kind of static the universe produces naturally. Then, at 3:47, every screen in the control room went white. Not static, just pure white light, brighter than anything I'd ever seen. The surge was so powerful, it fried the primary systems instantly. Circuit breakers couldn't trip fast enough. We could smell the electronics burning, that acrid smell of melting plastic and scorched silicon. The electromagnetic pulse knocked out everything except the backup generators, and even those flickered for a moment before stabilizing. When those kicked in and the emergency lights came on, the crew noticed something through the windows, a glow on the horizon, about 2 miles northwest of the facility. At first they thought it might be the aurora borealis, but the quality of the light was wrong. Too concentrated, too bright, and it wasn't moving the way the aurora moves. This was stationary, pulsing slightly like something breathing. Griffin continues, "We waited until first light because protocol says we don't leave the facility at night in those conditions. Temperature was 30 below, and in the dark, with our navigation systems down, we could easily get lost and die before dawn. So we watched that light through the windows for 3 hours, taking turns, documenting it with our phones since all our equipment was dead. The light gradually faded as the sun started to rise, but we could see smoke, or something like smoke, rising from that location. When dawn came, we took 2 snowmobiles and headed toward where we'd seen the light. The snow was fresh from a storm the night before. We could see this trail, like something had come down at an angle, dragging through the snow. The trail was about 15 feet wide and went on for almost half a mile. Trees were snapped off at the trunk along the path, just sheared clean through, and there were these burn marks in the snow, places where the ice had melted and refroze into strange, smooth shapes. We followed the trail for 20 minutes before we found it. What they found at the end of that trail changed everything. It was face down in the snow, wings spread 30 feet across, maybe more. At first, I thought it was some kind of experimental aircraft, Griffin says. The wings looked almost metallic in the sunlight, catching the light in a way that made them seem to glow. But as we got closer, I could see they weren't metal. They were covered in these things that looked like feathers, but when the light hit them, they reflected colours I'd never seen before. Colours that shouldn't exist, that my brain couldn't quite process. And then I saw the hands. It had hands. Human hands, but wrong. Too many fingers, and they were arranged in a way that made my skin crawl. One of my crew members, a young woman named Patricia, she started crying when she saw it. Just broke down completely. We had to send her back to the station. The recovery team spent 6 hours carefully excavating the body from the snow. They documented everything with photographs and video, working in shifts because the cold was brutal and the sight of the thing was affecting everyone differently. Some people couldn't look at it for more than a few seconds. Others couldn't look away. Griffin himself spent most of those 6 hours just staring at it, trying to understand what he was seeing. The military was contacted immediately, and Griffin made it clear this wasn't a request for assistance. This was a situation that was beyond their capability to handle. By nightfall, a team had arrived by helicopter, 3 massive transport choppers that landed in the clearing near the crash site. By the next morning, the body was in transit, wrapped in specialized containment materials, surrounded by armed guards. That's when I got the call. I was in my office reviewing case files when my director walked in and closed the door behind him, which was unusual. Robert had been my director for 8 years, and in that time, he'd never closed the door unless the conversation was going to be difficult. He told me I was being temporarily reassigned to a classified project, federal level, and I'd be leaving within the hour. I wasn't allowed to tell anyone, including my wife, where I was going or what I'd be working on. He handed me a folder with a single sheet of paper inside, instructions for where to go and who to contact when I arrived. The rest of the folder was empty. No case details, no preliminary reports, nothing. Just an address and a phone number. 3 hours later, I was at a government medical facility I didn't know existed, underground beneath a military installation in rural Virginia. The facility was designed for exactly this kind of situation, completely isolated, climate-controlled, everything you'd need to conduct a thorough post-mortem examination in absolute secrecy. They brought me to a preparation room first and made me sign documents, non-disclosure agreements with criminal penalties. A man in an Air Force uniform, a colonel whose name I never learned, explained that what I was about to see was classified at the highest level. He used words like national security and existential threat. He told me that if I spoke about this to anyone, including my wife, including other pathologists, including my lawyer, I would spend the rest of my life in a federal prison. He wasn't threatening me. He was simply stating a fact. Then they took me to the examination room, and I've tried to describe what I felt when I first saw it, but words always fail me. Every time I try to explain it to myself in the privacy of my own thoughts, I find myself falling short. It was lying on a stainless steel table under bright surgical lights. The wings had been carefully folded to fit in the room, but even folded, they extended 6 feet on either side. The table itself was specially constructed, reinforced to handle the weight and size. The body itself appeared male, humanoid, maybe 6 feet tall, not counting the skeletal extensions that supported the wings. The musculature was clearly masculine. The bone structure suggested male anatomy, but there were no external genitalia that I could see at first glance. The skin had this quality to it, luminescent, not glowing exactly, but like it was lit from within, as if there were lights beneath the surface struggling to shine through. There were these small structures embedded in the skin, thousands of them scattered across the body, like freckles or beauty marks. They formed patterns that almost seemed deliberate, constellations mapped onto flesh. Later we'd learn they were photophores, similar to what you'd find in deep-sea creatures like anglerfish or lanternfish, organisms that create their own light in the darkness of the ocean depths. But these were more complex, more sophisticated. Under magnification, each one contained multiple chambers and what appeared to be reflective surfaces. I remember my hands were shaking as I approached the table. I'd performed my first autopsy 23 years ago, and I'd learned to be clinical, detached, because it's necessary in this work. You can't function as a pathologist if you think too deeply about the humanity of what you're examining. But standing there, looking at this being, I felt something I hadn't felt since medical school. Fear. Not fear of the body itself, but fear of what it meant. Fear of the implications. If this thing was real, if it had lived and died, then everything we understood about biology, about evolution, about our place in the universe, was about to be rewritten. My assistant for this examination was Zach Deaver, a pathologist's assistant I'd worked with before. Good technician, steady hands, doesn't rattle easily. I'd specifically requested him because I knew I'd need someone who could stay focused under pressure. But when he walked in and saw the body, I watched all the colour drain from his face. He stood in the doorway for a full minute, just staring, his mouth slightly open. "What is it?" he asked me, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I told him, "but we're going to find out." We started with external examination, standard procedure even for the least standard subject imaginable. We measured everything and documented every detail. The being was 6 feet, 2 inches from head to foot. The wings, when we carefully unfolded them later, measured 32 feet, 4 inches from tip to tip. The wingspan was extraordinary, and the wings themselves defied every principle of biology I understood. 4 primary bone structures extended from modified shoulder blades, similar to what you'd see in a bird's wing, but scaled up and reinforced. Each bone was hollow, we could tell from the density, but the structure was unlike anything in nature. When we x-rayed them later, we found an internal architecture that looked almost crystalline, geometric in ways that natural bone never is. The surface was covered with these crystalline filaments, arranged like feathers. When Zach touched one carefully, wearing latex gloves, it made a sound like wind chimes, a high, clear note that lingered in the air. "They're not feathers," he said, examining one under a magnifying lens. "Each one has these microscopic air chambers. Look at how the light moves through them." He was right. Under magnification, each filament was a work of art, containing hundreds of tiny chambers that caught and refracted light. The effect was mesmerizing and slightly nauseating at the same time. When we shone a light directly on the wings, the filaments refracted it into colors that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle. Colors I'd never seen before and haven't seen since. They weren't colors from the normal spectrum. They were something else, something my brain struggled to interpret. It was beautiful and deeply unsettling at the same time. I found myself having to look away after a few seconds because staring at them too long made my eyes water and gave me a headache that pulsed behind my temples. The hands made your brain hurt to comprehend. 7 fingers on each hand. Each finger had 3 joints instead of 2, giving them an incredible range of motion. The bone structure was elegant, designed for both strength and incredible dexterity. I could imagine these hands creating things of extraordinary delicacy, manipulating tools or instruments with precision beyond human capability. The proportions were almost right, almost human, but just different enough to trigger something primal in your hindbrain, that ancient part of the brain that recognizes patterns and screams when the patterns are wrong. Looking at those hands, I felt the same unease you feel when you see a mannequin in low light and mistake it for a person. That moment of cognitive dissonance when reality doesn't match expectation. The face was worse. Humanoid features, eyes, nose, mouth. But the eyes were larger, positioned slightly more to the sides of the head, giving it a wider field of vision than humans possess. The bone structure of the face was elongated, the jaw more pronounced, the cheekbones higher and more angular. It was beautiful in its way, but it was an alien beauty, something that existed in the uncanny valley between human and other. The mouth, when we opened it, contained no teeth. Instead, there were these cartilaginous ridges, like what you'd find in some species of fish or in certain filter-feeding whales. They were arranged in rows, designed for something, though what I couldn't yet determine. The eyes themselves were closed, the eyelids smooth and unmarked. When we carefully opened them, using a probe to lift the lids, we found eyes that were larger than human eyes. The irises a colour I'd describe as silver gold, like sunlight on water. The pupils were vertical slits like a cat's eye. The sclera, the white part of human eyes, was instead a pale blue. Even in death, those eyes seemed to hold something, some quality of awareness that made me deeply uncomfortable. We took photographs, documenting every detail, but the photographs never captured what it was like to look into those eyes in person. We took the body's temperature using a digital thermometer, inserting it into several locations to get accurate readings. 36 hours after death, it was still 72 degrees. And yes, that's room temperature, but the room was kept at 65. Something in the tissue was maintaining heat, some mechanism we didn't yet understand. The implications were staggering. Normal mammalian bodies cool at a predictable rate after death, roughly 1.5 degrees per hour. This body should have been ice cold by now, but it wasn't. It was warm to the touch, almost alive. Zach ran his scanner over the body, checking for radiation, chemical residue, anything that might tell us what we were dealing with. "I'm getting readings I don't understand," he said, staring at the display screen. "There's electrical activity, faint, but it's there. Like the cells are still firing, even though there's no heartbeat. We recorded everything, documented every anomaly." The scanner picked up electromagnetic fields surrounding the body, weak but measurable. It was as if the body itself was generating some kind of field, even in death. We took tissue samples from the skin, using a standard biopsy punch. Under the microscope, the cells were recognizable as organic tissue, but the structure was denser than human skin. 3 layers where we'd expect 2. The dermal layer was 3 times thicker than normal human tissue, and the cells themselves were packed more tightly together. The cellular walls appeared reinforced, strengthened by some kind of protein matrix we couldn't immediately identify. Beneath that we found a subcutaneous layer containing a gel-like substance, clear, viscous, with a consistency somewhere between synovial fluid and petroleum jelly. We had no idea what it was for. We collected samples in sterile containers, labelled them, and set them aside for later analysis. Everything about this body suggests adaptation, I noted into my recorder, but adaptation to what environment? What conditions would require this kind of specialised development? The skin alone suggested an organism designed to withstand extreme conditions, possibly extreme temperatures, or pressures. The density would provide protection, the gel layer might serve as insulation or shock absorption, but adaptation implies evolution, and evolution takes millions of years. What we were looking at suggested something else, something more deliberate. After 6 hours of external examination, we were ready to begin the autopsy itself. The Y incision, I've made this cut thousands of times. It's the fundamental cut of any autopsy, starting at each shoulder, meeting at the sternum, then continuing down to the pubic bone. It opens the body completely, allowing access to all the major organs. I positioned my scalpel at the right shoulder, ready to cut down to the sternum, and I remember taking a deep breath, steadying myself. This was it. This was the moment we'd see what was inside. The blade wouldn't penetrate. I applied more pressure, thinking maybe I hadn't pressed hard enough. The skin resisted. It wasn't like cutting through thick leather or tough muscle tissue. It was like the tissue itself was tougher, denser, designed to resist cutting. I had to bear down with significant force to make the initial incision, putting my full weight behind the blade. When it finally cut through, I felt it give way suddenly, and I nearly lost my balance. The edges of the incision didn't bleed. The blood had pooled internally, but it didn't flow like human blood. It was thicker, more viscous, and the color was wrong. Silver blue, like oxidized copper, or like the blood you'd see in a horseshoe crab. We completed the Y incision, my hand growing tired from the effort of cutting through that incredibly tough skin. By the time we finished, my wrist was aching. Zach helped me pull back the skin, peeling it away from the underlying tissue. The subcutaneous layer was extensive, filled with that gel substance, and as we exposed it to air, it seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat waves on pavement, like it was reacting to the oxygen or the light. The smell was unusual too, not the smell of decay or death, but something else, something almost metallic, with a hint of ozone, like the smell after a lightning strike. The rib cage was immediately visible, and it was wrong. 14 pairs of ribs instead of 12, and the sternum extended 8 inches lower than human anatomy, protecting organs we couldn't yet see. The bones themselves appeared white and smooth, perfectly formed, without the slight irregularities you see in human bone. They looked almost manufactured, too perfect to be natural. "We need to see the bone density," I said. Zach brought over the portable X-ray, and what we saw changed everything we thought we knew about flight biology. "They're hollow," Zach said, studying the images on the display screen. "Like bird bones. But look at the internal structure. The interior of each bone contained this honeycomb architecture of incredible complexity, struts and supports arranged in a way that provided maximum strength with minimum weight, engineering that made modern aircraft design look primitive. The patterns were geometric, almost fractal, repeating at different scales. It was beautiful from an engineering perspective, elegant in a way that natural bone never is. Natural bone is strong, but messy, full of irregularities and inefficiencies. This was perfect, optimized, designed. We used the bone saw to cut through the ribs, needing to access the internal organs. Even with the hollow structure, they were remarkably strong. The saw blade struggled, heating up from the friction. It took twice as long as it would with human ribs, and we had to stop twice to let the saw cool down. When we finally opened the chest cavity, carefully lifting away the section of ribs we'd cut through, we both stopped and stared. "Where are the lungs?" Zach asked, and I couldn't answer him because I was asking myself the same question. There were no lungs, not in any traditional sense. Instead, we found this network of air sacs throughout the entire torso cavity, dozens of them, interconnected, each about the size of a golf ball, arranged around and between the other organs. They formed this complex three-dimensional network, connected by tubes that branched and rebranched like the roots of a tree. I'd seen something similar before, but only in birds. Birds have air sacs that extend throughout their bodies, even into their hollow bones, making them incredibly efficient breathers. But this system was far more advanced, far more complex. "Look at this," Zach said, carefully tracing one of the sacs with a gloved finger. "They connect to the bones. The air sacs literally extend into the skeletal structure." It meant the entire skeleton functioned as a respiratory organ. Every bone in the body was part of the breathing system. Air would flow through the sacs, into the bones, through the bones, and back out again, in a continuous circuit. The efficiency would be extraordinary. This being could extract oxygen in environments where humans would suffocate, could breathe at altitudes where the air is too thin to support human life. We took samples of the air sac tissue, carefully cutting away small sections and preserving them. Under the microscope, the cells were unlike anything in our databases. The walls of the sacs were incredibly thin, just a few cells thick, but remarkably strong. And the cells themselves appeared capable of extracting oxygen at a molecular level far more efficiently than human lung tissue, perhaps 10 or 20 times more efficient. "This thing could breathe at altitude," I said, making notes on my recorder. "High altitude. Maybe even in low oxygen environments that would kill us in minutes. Or in atmospheres with different gas compositions, environments where oxygen is scarce and other gases are abundant." The adaptation suggested something extraordinary, a being designed to survive in conditions no human could tolerate. Next, we located the heart. It was positioned in the center of the chest, not offset to the left, like in humans, nestled among the air sacs. The heart itself was larger than a human heart, roughly the size of 2 fists rather than 1. And when we examined it closely, we found it had 4 chambers, but the configuration was different. 2 chambers appeared designed for systemic circulation, 2 for pulmonary, but the separation was more complete than in human hearts, with thicker walls between chambers and more sophisticated valve systems. The efficiency would be remarkable, allowing for better oxygenation of blood and more powerful circulation. But that wasn't the most extraordinary thing. As we traced the blood vessels leading from the heart, carefully following them through the body, we discovered something unprecedented. "There are 3 separate circulatory systems," Zach said, his voice barely above a whisper, and I could hear the awe and fear in his tone. He was right. The primary system served the internal organs, like our own circulatory system, carrying oxygen-rich blood throughout the body. But there was a secondary system, completely separate, dedicated entirely to the wings and the massive musculature required to power them. The wings had their own blood supply, their own network of arteries and veins, completely independent of the main system. And a third system, very fine vessels, connecting directly to those footfalls in the skin, delivering whatever nutrients or energy they needed to function. "How is this possible?" Zach asked, and I couldn't answer because I didn't know. 3 separate circulatory systems meant 3 separate networks of blood vessels, 3 times the complexity, 3 times the resources required to maintain the system. We collected blood samples from each system, carefully extracting the thick silver-blue fluid. The blood itself was fascinating, copper-based rather than iron-based. Instead of hemoglobin, it contained hemocyanin, the same oxygen-carrying molecule found in some mollusks and arthropods, creatures like octopuses and horseshoe crabs. That explained the silver-blue color. In creatures with hemocyanin, the blood appears blue when oxygenated because of the copper, but the concentration was far higher than in any terrestrial creature. This being's blood could carry oxygen with incredible efficiency, perhaps 3 or 4 times better than human blood. Combined with the skeletal respiratory system, it could have survived in environments that would be instantly fatal to humans. The heart tissue itself showed no signs of disease, no arterial plaque, No scarring, no indication of any cardiovascular stress. It appeared almost new, despite what we would later learn about the age of this being. When we cut into the heart muscle, the tissue was firm and healthy, showing none of the wear you'd expect from centuries of use. Under the microscope, the cardiac cells showed minimal deterioration, as if the heart had been beating for decades rather than centuries. We moved on to the digestive system, following the esophagus down from the throat. The esophagus led to a stomach, simple enough, a muscular sac designed for holding and digesting food. But below that there was no intestinal tract, no small intestine, no large intestine, no colon. Instead, there was a single chamber below the stomach, about the size of a football, connected to the stomach by a short tube. Highly specialized tissue lined the interior, tissue that looked almost like velvet under magnification, covered in millions of tiny projections. When we analyzed it later, we found it was capable of breaking down and absorbing nutrients with almost perfect efficiency. There's almost no waste, Zach observed, examining the chamber carefully. Everything that goes in gets used. The chamber connected to a very small excretory duct, suggesting minimal waste production. The efficiency was remarkable, suggesting a being that could survive on very little food, extracting maximum nutrition from whatever it consumed. The stomach contents were minimal, just a few ounces of partially digested material. It appeared to be plant-based. We could see cellular structures that suggested vegetable matter, but the cellular structure didn't match any known plant species. The cells were too regular, too organized, and they contained compounds we couldn't identify. Whatever it had eaten last, it had eaten days or possibly weeks before death. The absence of a complex digestive system suggested this being didn't need to eat often. The efficiency of its digestion meant it could extract maximum nutrition from minimal food, surviving for extended periods without eating. The adaptation suggested a being designed for long journeys, extended periods where food might not be available. After 10 hours of examination, we were exhausted, but there was still one more critical system to examine: the nervous system, the brain, the seat of consciousness and thought. Removing the brain required cutting through the skull. We used the bone saw, and the blade screamed as it cut through, the high-pitched whine filling the examination room. The skull was thicker than human skull, perhaps twice as thick, but the bone was that same hollow honeycomb structure, strong but light. Cutting through it took another hour, working carefully to avoid damaging the brain tissue underneath. When we finally lifted away the top of the skull, carefully removing the cap of bone, we found a brain that was immediately recognizable, and yet completely alien. The size was the first thing that struck us. The cranial capacity was 30%, larger than human, and the brain itself filled the entire space with very little cerebrospinal fluid around it. In humans, the brain floats in cerebrospinal fluid, which cushions it and protects it from impact. This brain appeared to have minimal cushioning, suggesting either a much more robust structure or some other form of protection we didn't understand. The structure showed regions we recognized: the cerebrum, cerebellum, brainstem, the basic architecture of a complex brain. But there were additions, structures that didn't exist in human brains. The frontal lobe, the area associated with higher reasoning and decision-making, was massively developed, far beyond human proportion. It occupied perhaps 40% of the total brain volume, compared to about 30% in humans. This thing could think, Zach said quietly. Really think. Maybe better than we can. The implications were staggering. A brain this size, with this much frontal lobe development, suggested intelligence that might exceed human intelligence, consciousness that might perceive and process reality in ways we couldn't imagine. But the most extraordinary discovery came when we examined the brainstem, the ancient part of the brain that controls basic functions like breathing and heartbeat. There was an organ attached to it that we'd never seen before, about the size of a walnut, dark purple in colour, connected directly to the base of the brain by a thick bundle of nerves. When we dissected this organ, cutting into it carefully, we found it contained crystalline structures, the same type of crystalline material we'd found in the wing filaments. The structures were arranged in geometric patterns, forming what looked almost like circuitry. "What is it?" Zach asked, and I stared at it for a long time before answering. "I think it's a sensory organ," I said, "but for sensing what?" We sent samples to our lab for analysis, carefully packaging the tissue and sending it through the secure channels they'd established. The results came back 3 days later, and they confirmed what I'd suspected. The crystalline structures appeared to be sensitive to electromagnetic fields. This organ would allow the being to sense, and perhaps even navigate, by electromagnetic radiation, perceiving radio waves, microwaves, magnetic fields, things that are completely invisible to human senses. It could sense things we can't even perceive, I told Zach when we reviewed the results. Radio waves, magnetic fields, maybe even more. It had access to an entire dimension of reality that's invisible to us. Imagine being able to sense cell phone signals, Wi-Fi networks, the Earth's magnetic field, cosmic radiation. Imagine perceiving all of that as directly as we perceive light and sound. This being lived in a richer sensory environment than we can possibly imagine. The spinal column extended from the brainstem down through the torso, but it didn't stop there. It extended into the wing structure, branching out to follow the wing bones. Direct neural pathways connected the brain to every part of the wings, millions of nerve connections, allowing for incredibly precise control. The being would have had incredibly precise control over its flight, able to adjust wing position and angle with the precision of a thought. We examined the nerve bundles, tracing them through the body. Millions of connections, far more than humans have. The complexity was staggering. The wing muscles could respond to thought almost instantaneously, allowing for aerial maneuvers that would be impossible for any bird or aircraft. After 14 hours of examination, we had documented every system, every organ, mapped the entire internal structure. But we still didn't know the most important thing. What had killed it? We searched for trauma, for disease, for any sign of system failure. Most of the organs appeared healthy, functioning organs that showed no signs of distress. There were no tumours, no infections, no signs of aging or germ deterioration. Everything we looked at suggested a being in perfect health, but something had killed it, something catastrophic. But then we found it, deep in the chest cavity, hidden among the air sacs. Massive internal hemorrhaging in the secondary circulatory system, the system that fed the wings. The blood vessels had ruptured catastrophically, torn apart from the inside. The wing muscles showed signs of extreme strain, tissue damage at the cellular level, fibers torn and shredded. We examined the damage carefully, documenting every detail. The vessels hadn't just ruptured, they'd exploded, blown apart by pressure that exceeded their capacity. We examined the wings more carefully, looking for external signs of damage. The edges of the wings showed burns, not fire burns, but heat damage consistent with atmospheric friction. Extreme heat like what you'd see on a spacecraft during re-entry. The crystalline filaments along the edges were blackened and cracked, damaged by temperatures that must have exceeded several thousand degrees. It fell, I said, studying the burn patterns, from a great height, possibly from space. The strain on the system was too much. The secondary circulation couldn't handle it. The vessels burst. It bled out internally. Zach examined the wing bones under magnification, using a high-powered microscope to study the internal structure. "Look at these microfractures," he said, pointing to the screen. "Hundreds of them, thousands maybe. The entire internal structure is compromised. It pushed itself beyond what even this body could handle. The bones were still intact, still whole, but internally they were a web of tiny cracks, stress fractures that ran through the honeycomb structure like lightning. Whatever had happened, the being had been trying to reach Earth, or trying to leave it, and the attempt had killed it. The entry into the atmosphere, or the exit from it, had subjected the body to forces that exceeded even its remarkable capabilities. The wings had burned, the circulation system had failed, and it had fallen from the sky, crashing into the snow in Alaska, where Griffin and his team had found it. The question was why? What had driven it to push itself to the point of catastrophic failure? What was so important that it was worth dying for? We needed answers, and those answers might lie in the genetic code, in the very DNA that had built this extraordinary body. We sent tissue samples to Dr. Lisa Hayes, a geneticist who'd been brought onto the project. She worked in a separate lab, isolated from us, sequencing the DNA we'd extracted from multiple tissue samples. 3 days later, she called us with her results. I could hear the tension in her voice over the phone, could hear the fear and excitement mixed together. "You need to see this," she said, in person. "Don't discuss it over the phone." We met her in the genetics lab, a clean room filled with sequencing machines and computer terminals. She had the sequencing results displayed on multiple screens that covered an entire wall. The helical structure of DNA was visible, that familiar twisted ladder shape, but something about it looked wrong, subtly wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. "The DNA is recognizable," Dr. Hayes said, gesturing to the screens. "Double helix, base pairs, all the structures we'd expect, but the sequences themselves," she pulled up a comparison chart, human DNA on one side, the being's DNA on the other, displayed as long strings of coloured letters representing the base pairs. "There's approximately 40% genetic similarity with humans," she continued. 40%. That's significant. That's more than we share with most primates. She let that sink in for a moment. We share about 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees, about 90% with mice, about 60% with chickens. This being shared 40% with humans, suggesting a relationship that was distant but undeniable. "What about the other 60%? I asked, staring at the screens. "That's what's disturbing," she said, and I could hear her voice shaking slightly. "The remaining 60% contains sequences I've never seen before, not in any terrestrial organism. We've sequenced thousands of genomes, everything from bacteria to whales, and nothing matches these sequences. And some of these gene expressions, they're not random, they're precise. Too precise." She pulled up another screen, highlighting specific genetic markers, sections of DNA that glowed in different colours. "This isn't evolution," she said flatly. "Evolution is messy. It's trial and error over millions of years. Random mutations that sometimes provide advantages, most times don't. It's inefficient and wasteful and beautiful in its chaos. This is different. Look at the precision. These genes are exactly where they need to be to produce exactly the right proteins for the systems you found. The respiratory sacs, the multiple circulatory systems, the enhanced brain development, the electromagnetic sense organ. Everything is optimized, perfected. This is engineering." The implications hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. "Someone designed this," Zach said quietly, and the words seemed to echo in the sterile lab. "Or something," Dr. Hayes added. "I ran an aging analysis on the cells. Based on telomere length and cellular deterioration, I can estimate how old this being was when it died." She paused, like she didn't quite believe what she was about to say, like saying it out loud would make it real in a way that frightened her. "Approximately 300 years old." The number didn't make sense at first, didn't fit into any framework I had for understanding biology. 300 years. It had been alive when the United States was founded, when Mozart was composing, while the Industrial Revolution was just beginning. It had existed through centuries of human history, watching civilizations rise and fall, technologies develop and evolve. The cellular deterioration is minimal, Dr. Hayes continued. If it hadn't died from trauma, it might have lived for centuries more, maybe millennia. I can't find any indication of maximum lifespan in the genetic code. There's no programmed senescence, no biological clock counting down to inevitable death. The cells appear capable of dividing indefinitely without the deterioration we see in human cells. We stood there in silence, trying to process what we'd learned. This wasn't just an unknown creature. This was something that lived for centuries, engineered with precision beyond our understanding, capable of sensing and navigating through dimensions of reality we couldn't perceive, and it had died trying to reach or leave our world. And somewhere, whoever or whatever had created it was still out there, still existed, still possessed the capability to engineer life at this level. The next day, everything changed. I arrived at the facility to find military personnel everywhere, armed guards at every door, officers in dress uniforms, conferring in the hallways. The atmosphere had shifted from scientific curiosity to something else, something darker. My director met me outside the examination room, and I could see the anger and frustration in his face. "They're shutting us down," he said. "Orders from above, way above. Everything gets handed over to the military. All samples, all documentation, all records. We're not finished," I protested. "There's still more we need to understand. We haven't examined the reproductive system, haven't fully analysed all the genetic data, haven't determined the function of several organs we found." "It doesn't matter," he said. "The decision's been made. This is beyond science now. This is national security." Over the next 6 hours we watched as they dismantled everything we'd built. They took the body, carefully packaged and loaded into a specialised transport container filled with preservative fluids. They took every tissue sample, every slide, every photograph, every piece of evidence that this examination had ever happened. They took our computers, removing hard drives and destroying them right in front of us. They took our notes, even our personal notebooks where we'd scribbled observations and thoughts. They took our personal recordings, everything we documented on our phones or personal devices. They made each of us sign additional non-disclosure agreements, thicker than the first ones, with more detailed descriptions of the penalties for violation. The penalties were severe: federal prison, minimum 20 years, maximum life. We were told that as far as the official record was concerned, this examination had never happened. The facility would be sterilised, all equipment destroyed, all records erased. "What's the official story?" Zach asked, one of the officers, a grim-faced man with colonel's insignia. "Weather balloon," the officer said without a trace of irony, without even a hint that he understood how absurd that sounded. "Crashed in Alaska. Recovered and disposed of. Nothing unusual. Standard debris from a high-altitude research platform." By evening, the facility was empty. The examination room had been cleaned, sterilised, all traces of our work erased. The table where the body had laid was gone, removed entirely. The walls had been scrubbed. The floor had been stripped and refinished. It was as if the past 2 weeks had been a dream, as if we'd imagined everything. But they couldn't erase what we'd seen, what we'd learned, what we'd held in our hands. I went home that night and lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what it all meant. An engineered being, designed to live for centuries, capable of flight, and adapted to survive in extreme environments. And somewhere, whoever or whatever had created it was still out there, still working, still creating. Were there more of these beings? How many? What was their purpose? Why were they here? 2 weeks later, Griffin Weeks called me. We weren't supposed to be in contact. The non-disclosure agreements explicitly forbade it, but he had information he thought I needed to know. "I've been doing research," he said, his voice low like he was afraid of being overheard. "Looking into historical records, similar incidents. I found 11 documented cases over the past 200 years. Bodies recovered, then quickly classified or buried. Aurora, Texas in 1897, a farmer found something in his field, something with wings, and it was buried in the local cemetery before anyone could examine it properly. Roswell. In 1947, everyone talks about the craft, but there were other recoveries that were never discussed. Biological remains that were shipped to undisclosed locations. Reports from medieval Europe. Descriptions in monastery records of angels falling from the sky. Their bodies examined by monks who recorded details that match what we found. Ancient Chinese records. Texts that describe winged beings that fell to earth and were taken by the emperor's physicians. "How far back does it go?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "I found references in texts that are 1,000 years old," Griffin said. "Descriptions that match what we found almost exactly. Always the wings. Always the unusual anatomy. Religious texts described them in detail, but everyone assumed it was metaphor, mythology, artistic license. But what if it wasn't? What if people throughout history have been finding these things, examining them, trying to understand them? They've been here all along," I said. "Or they've been visiting all along," Griffin replied. "The question is why? And why are they falling? Are they dying off? Is this some kind of mass death event? Or are they coming here deliberately, sacrificing themselves for some purpose we can't understand?" 3 weeks after the facility was shut down, I received an encrypted email. The sender was anonymous, but I recognized the writing style, the specific terminology, the way of describing anatomical features. Another pathologist, someone who'd been brought in for a similar examination. The email contained a single paragraph. No greeting, no signature, just information. 3 weeks ago, a body was recovered from the Pacific Ocean, caught in fishing nets off the coast of Japan. Female. Same anatomical features. Same wing structure. Same multiple circulatory systems. Same crystalline organ. We found everything you found. They sent me your report to compare. Everything matches down to the smallest details. This isn't an isolated incident. You need to know that. The email deleted itself after I read it, the text fading from the screen and the file erasing itself from my computer. They'd found another one, a second body thousands of miles away from the first, recovered from the ocean instead of from snow. Same biology, same engineering, same evidence of deliberate design. Which meant there were more, had to be more, maybe dozens, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands scattered across the world, living in secret or dying in silence. The question wasn't whether angels existed. We'd proven that beyond any doubt. We'd dissected one, documented every system, every organ, found evidence of genetic engineering beyond anything humans were capable of, confirmed lifespans measured in centuries. The question was how many were left, and what did they want? I still go to work every day. I still perform autopsies, examining the bodies of ordinary people who died ordinary deaths. Car accidents and heart attacks, cancer and old age, the usual causes that fill a medical examiner's schedule. But sometimes I find myself looking at the sky at night, standing in my backyard, while my wife sleeps inside, staring up at the stars and wondering, are they watching us? Are they waiting for something? Are they dying off one by one, falling from whatever heights they inhabit? Are they trying to reach us, trying to communicate something we're not capable of understanding? We dissected a myth and found flesh. We cut open the divine and found biology. Lungs that breathed through bones. Hearts that pumped 3 different circulatory systems. brains developed beyond our own capacity, wings designed for flight in ways we're still trying to understand, blood that carried oxygen with impossible efficiency, organs we couldn't identify, systems we couldn't explain. But knowing what's inside doesn't tell us what it means. We proved they're real. We proved they can die. We proved they've been here, perhaps for all of human history, falling from the sky and being found by people who didn't know what they were seeing. Everything else remains a mystery, wrapped in layers of classification and secrecy. Sometimes, late at night, I pull out the one thing they didn't take from me, a single photograph I'd hidden in my personal files, saved to a cloud server under a false name. It shows the being's face, eyes closed, that strange, almost human expression, peaceful in death. I look at it and wonder what it saw in those 300 years of life. What cities had it watched rise and fall? What wars had it witnessed? What changes had it seen in human civilization? What it knew that we don't? What it was trying to tell us by coming here, by pushing itself to the point of death in an attempt to reach us or leave us? And I wonder if we'll ever see another one, if another will fall from the sky, bringing more questions than answers. I wonder if there will come a day when they stop falling, when whatever brought them here no longer brings them, and we're left alone again, truly alone, with nothing but myths and faded photographs to remember them by. There's one more thing, something I haven't told anyone, not even Zach, not even my wife, because I'm not sure anyone would believe me, and I'm not sure I believe it myself. That last night in the facility, before they shut everything down, I was alone in the examination room doing one final review of my notes, trying to memorize details I knew I'd never see again. The body was still there, lying on the table, prepared for transport the next morning. I was standing next to the table, looking at those wings one last time, running my gloved hand over the crystalline filaments, when I heard it. A sound, very faint, coming from the body. Not a mechanical sound, not the building settling, not the ventilation system. Something else, something that sounded organic, biological, alive. It sounded like breathing. One slow breath, drawn in and released. The sound of air moving through passages that should have been still and silent. I checked for a pulse immediately, pressing my fingers to the neck, to the wrist, finding the places where major arteries should be. Nothing. No heartbeat. No respiration. The being had been dead for 17 days. But I heard that sound, clear as anything, undeniable and impossible. One breath, then silence. I stood there for 10 minutes listening. My own breathing stopped, my own heart pounding in my ears. Nothing else. Just that one breath, and then nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the stress had gotten to me. 2 weeks of examining something that shouldn't exist, of documenting the impossible, of trying to understand something beyond my capability to understand. Maybe it was just the building's ventilation system, air moving through ducts in just the right way to create a sound like breathing, but I don't think so. I think some part of it was still there, still present, still aware. Not alive exactly, but not completely gone either. Something remained, some echo or residue of consciousness, and I think it wanted me to know, wanted me to understand that death wasn't the end. Not for beings like this, beings that lived for centuries and sensed dimensions of reality we couldn't perceive. Before I left that night, knowing I'd never see the body again, never have another chance, I did something I probably shouldn't have done, something that violated every principle of scientific objectivity. I'd been taught. I leaned close to the body and I whispered to it. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely audible, even to myself. "I'm sorry we did this to you. I'm sorry you died here, alone and far from wherever you came from. I'm sorry we cut you open and examined you like a specimen, like an object of study, rather than a being that lived and thought and felt. I hope you found what you were looking for. I hope your death meant something. And maybe this is crazy. Maybe I was just exhausted and emotionally drained, operating on no sleep and too much coffee, but I swear I felt something. A change in the air, a shift in temperature, a presence that hadn't been there before, something that felt like acknowledgement, like understanding, like gratitude. The photophores in the skin, those thousands of light-producing organs, they flickered, just for a moment, a wave of dim light that passed across the body like a ripple across water. Then it was gone, and the room was just a room, and the body was just a body, cold and still and dead. The next morning they took it away, and I never saw it again. But I remember. I'll always remember. And sometimes when I look up at the stars, I think about that moment, that strange sense of connection with something so far beyond human understanding that we don't even have words for it. We call them angels, but that word doesn't capture what they really are. It's too small, too limited, too tied to our myths and legends and religious traditions. There's something else, something older, something that existed before humans gave them names, something we're not ready to understand, maybe something we'll never be ready to understand. But they're real. I've seen the proof. I've held it in my hands, felt the weight of those wings, traced the pathways of that alien circulatory system, held that enormous brain, and marveled at its complexity. And that changes everything. It changes how we see ourselves, our place in the universe, our understanding of what's possible. We're not alone. We never have been. And the things we share the universe with are more like us than we ever imagined. They live, they die, they fall from the sky. And sometimes in their final moments, they ask for forgiveness. One final detail. After I got home, after everything was over, after I'd tried and failed to return to normal life, I received a package. No return address, just my name and address written in careful block letters. Inside was a data drive, a small thumb drive wrapped in bubble wrap. I plugged it into my computer, using a laptop that wasn't connected to the internet, being careful in case it contained malware or tracking software. It contained a single audio file, a recording from the night of the crash, from the Alaska Research Station's monitoring equipment. Griffin Weeks had saved it somehow, hidden it before the military, confiscated everything, smuggled it out despite the risk to himself. The file was labelled simply December 14th, 3:47 a.m. I listened to it once, just once. I've never had the courage to listen again, though I've kept the drive, hidden it in a place where no one will find it unless they know exactly where to look. Static at first. White noise, the hiss and crackle of radio interference, the sound of electromagnetic chaos. Then, underneath the static, a voice speaking in a language I'd never heard, a language that didn't sound like any human language. The phonemes were wrong, the rhythm was wrong, the pitch rose and fell in ways that human voices don't rise and fall. The sounds weren't quite human, though they were made by vocal cords, by breath passing through a mouth. The cadence was wrong, too fast in some places, too slow in others. The tones were off, frequencies that made my ears hurt and my head ache. But at the end of the recording, just before the static consumed everything, just before the electromagnetic pulse destroyed the equipment and ended the recording, there were two words, clear as day, in English, spoken with an accent I couldn't place, but in a voice that was unmistakably the same voice that had been speaking that alien language. Forgive me. That was all. Just those two words, heavy with emotion, weighted with sorrow and regret. Then, silence. Then, the scream of the electromagnetic pulse, so loud on the recording that I had to rip off my headphones. Then nothing. I don't know who it was asking forgiveness from. God? Its creators? Us? Itself? I don't know what it had done, or what had been done to it. I don't know if it was apologizing for coming here, for disturbing us, for forcing us to confront the reality of its existence, or if it was apologizing for leaving, for dying before it could deliver whatever message it carried, whatever purpose had driven it to push itself to destruction. But I heard the pain in that voice, the regret, the sorrow. It wasn't the voice of something alien and incomprehensible. It was the voice of something that felt, that suffered, that understood loss and failure and despair. Whatever these beings are, wherever they come from, they feel. They suffer. They seek forgiveness. They're not so different from us after all, and that more than anything else we learned is what haunts me. We're not alone. We never have been. And the things we share the universe with are more like us than we ever imagined. They live for centuries, but they still die. They possess abilities we can't comprehend, but they still fail. They can sense dimensions of reality we can't perceive, but they still feel pain and regret. They live. They die. They fall from the sky. And sometimes in their final moments, they reach out across the vast gulf that separates us and ask for forgiveness in a language we can understand. This is Dr. Jake McDonald, signing off. May we all find the forgiveness we seek, and may we be ready when the next one falls to offer the compassion we failed to offer this one. We examined it, documented it, learned from it, but we never spoke to it. We never tried to understand it as a being, rather than as a specimen. That's my regret. That's what I ask forgiveness for. Next time, if there is a next time, maybe we'll do better. Maybe we'll remember that before it was a body on a table, it was a living being that crossed the vast darkness between the stars to reach us. And maybe that will make all the difference.